The carriage had barely stopped moving when the doors of Ashmore Hall opened, and Alara Whitmore understood, in that single breath, that she had married a stranger who did not want her there. Duke Alaric Grayson stood at the top of the stone steps, his face carved from something colder than the autumn wind that pulled at her cloak. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He only watched her climb down from the carriage alone, her trunk thumping onto the gravel behind her, as though she were cargo delivered rather than a bride arrived. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into a curtsy that felt foolish under his unmoving stare. "You will be shown to your rooms," he said. His voice was low and final, the voice of a man closing a door rather than opening one. "Margaret will see to it." He turned and walked back into the house before she had even risen from her curtsy. Alara stood there a moment longer than she meant to, the wind biting through her traveling dress, and felt the first cold seed of dread settle in her chest. This was not how a wedding night was supposed to begin. This was not how any marriage was supposed to begin. A woman appeared in the doorway, tall and narrow, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. This was Margaret Voss, the Duke's aunt, and she looked at Alara the way one might look at a stain on good linen. "Come along then," Margaret said. "The Duke does not like to be kept waiting, and neither do I." Alara followed her through a grand entrance hall, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her as she passed. The air smelled of beeswax and old stone, and beneath it, faintly, something else, something like neglect. "This house is beautiful," Alara offered, hoping to soften the silence. Margaret did not slow her pace. "This house has seen better days. And better wives." The words landed like a slap, though Margaret's tone never changed. Alara said nothing more. She had learned, in the 3 short weeks since her father arranged this marriage, that questions were rarely welcomed in this family. She had asked her father why a duke would choose her, a woman with no fortune and no particular beauty to speak of, and he had only patted her hand and told her to be grateful. She had tried to be grateful. Standing in this cold hallway now, she found gratitude harder to hold on to than she had expected. They climbed a wide staircase, then a narrower one, and then Alara noticed they were moving away from the main body of the house entirely, down a long corridor where the portraits stopped and the wallpaper grew faded and water-stained near the ceiling. "Where are we going?" Alara asked. "The East Wing," Margaret said. "Your rooms are here." Alara stopped walking. "The East Wing? But surely the Duchess's chambers are near the Duke's own rooms." Margaret turned, and for the first time, something flickered across her face. It might have been pity. It might have been something closer to warning. "The Duke has decided otherwise. You will not question his decisions in this house, Mrs. Grayson. It will go easier for you if you learn that now." The title struck strangely. Mrs. Grayson. Not Duchess. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if this was how her marriage was to be conducted. They reached a heavy oak door at the end of the corridor. Margaret pushed it open to reveal a chamber that was clean but plain, furnished with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a cold hearth with no fire lit despite the evening chill creeping through the windows. A single trunk, presumably carried up earlier by some unseen servant, sat at the foot of the bed. "You will take your meals here," Margaret said. "A maid will bring them. You are not to wander the house without invitation." "Not to wander," Alara repeated slowly. "In my own home." "This has never been your home," Margaret said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "It has only been given to you to live in. There is a difference, and you would do well to learn it quickly." She left without another word, her footsteps fading down the corridor, and Alara was alone. She stood in the center of the small room for a long moment, listening to the wind press against the window panes, feeling the strangeness of the day settle over her like a second, heavier cloak. She had imagined many things about her wedding night. Fear, certainly. Uncertainty, yes. But not this particular loneliness, sharp and specific, the loneliness of being unwanted by a man she had promised to spend her life beside. She crossed to the window and looked out over darkening grounds, a garden gone slightly wild, hedges untrimmed, a fountain dry and cracked. Somewhere beyond the glass, an owl called out, and the sound seemed to echo strangely, as though the house itself were hollow. A knock came at her door. Alara turned, half expecting Margaret again, but it was a young maid instead, carrying a tray with bread, cold meat, and a small pot of tea. The girl's eyes were kind, though nervous, darting toward the corridor before she fully stepped inside. "Begging your pardon, madam," the girl whispered. "I'm Nora. I'll be seeing to you while you're here." "Thank you, Nora." Alara took the tray gratefully. "Might I ask you something?" Nora glanced again toward the door, as though the walls themselves might carry word back to someone. "I oughtn't stay long, madam. Just one thing." Why am I here, in the East Wing? Is there some reason the Duke keeps this part of the house closed away? Something passed over the girl's face, quick and gone, like a shadow across water. It isn't my place to say, madam. Truly it isn't. But there is something. Nora's hands twisted the edge of her apron. There was another lady here once, before you came, the first Duchess. She had rooms in this very wing. At the end, past the western turn, her voice dropped lower still. Nobody speaks of her now. The Duke won't allow it. Ilara felt the cold seed in her chest bloom into something larger. What happened to her? She took ill, madam. That's what we're told. Nora's eyes did not quite meet hers. If you'll excuse me, I've other rooms to see to. The girl slipped out quickly, leaving Ilara alone with her tray and her questions, and the growing sense that Ashmore Hall held its secrets the way old houses hold their damp, deep in the walls, impossible to fully air out. Ilara ate little. She sat by the cold hearth and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and when full darkness fell, she lit a single candle and studied the room more carefully than she had before. It was, she noticed now, unusually bare. No portraits, no mirrors, as though someone had gone through and stripped away anything that might have belonged to whoever occupied it last. She thought of the first Duchess. She thought of the western turn, past which Nora had refused to look. She thought of Alaric's face on the steps, cold as the stone beneath his feet, and wondered what kind of man banished his new bride to a forgotten wing on the very night he ought to have welcomed her. Near midnight, unable to sleep, Ilara rose and pressed her ear to the door. The house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears rather than soothed them. She told herself she would simply look, just a glance down the corridor, toward the western turn Nora had spoken of. She was mistress of this house, whether anyone here wished to acknowledge it or not, and she would not spend her marriage cowering behind a locked door. She opened her door slowly, the hinges giving only the faintest whisper of sound, and stepped into the corridor. The candle in her hand threw long, trembling shadows against the water-stained walls. She walked slowly, counting her own footsteps to steady her nerves, until the corridor bent westward, just as Nora had described. There, at the end of a shorter passage, stood a door unlike any other in the wing. It was newer, its wood darker, fitted with a heavy iron lock that seemed entirely out of place in a house otherwise dressed in faded elegance. Someone had gone to great trouble to seal this room, and to seal it recently. Ilara stepped closer, and it was then that she heard it, a sound from behind the door. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft, dragging movement, followed by something that might have been a sigh, or might have been her own imagination playing tricks in the dark. She froze, candle flame dancing wildly as her hand trembled. "Who is there?" she whispered, though no part of her expected an answer. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so quiet she almost doubted it, she heard it again, a whisper, formless, carried through the thick wood of the door, and though she could not make out the words, she was certain, with a certainty that chilled her more than the night air ever could, that it was not the wind. Footsteps sounded suddenly behind her, quick and heavy, and Ilara spun around, heart lurching, to see Alaric himself standing at the far end of the corridor, his face lit strangely by her candle, his expression unlike anything she had seen from him yet. Not coldness now, something closer to fear. "You should not be here," he said, his voice tight and low, closing the distance between them in a few swift strides. "This part of the house is forbidden to you. Do you understand me? Forbidden. I only wish to know. It does not matter what you wish to know." He took her arm, not roughly, but firmly, guiding her back the way she had come. "You will stay in your rooms. You will not come here again. Whatever you heard, whatever you think you heard, you will forget it." "Someone is behind that door," Ilara said, refusing to let the words go unspoken. "I heard them." Alaric's grip tightened for just a moment before he released her at the door to her chamber. In the candlelight, his eyes held something raw and unguarded, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that same cold distance she had met on the front steps. "There is nothing behind that door that concerns you," he said. "For your own sake, Ilara, leave it be." He left her standing in her doorway, the candle guttering in her shaking hand, and though she returned to her narrow bed and pulled the blankets high, sleep did not come easily. She lay awake counting the hours, and somewhere in her mind, without quite meaning to, she began counting something else as well. One night, the first of however many nights this strange, cold marriage would demand of her. She did not yet know the number that waited at the end of it. She did not yet know that 30 nights from now, everything about this house, this marriage, and the secret behind that locked door would come crashing down around her. She knew only that sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, filled with the sound of a whisper she could not quite place, and the memory of fear in a duke's eyes that did not match the coldness of his voice. Morning came gray and reluctant over Ashmore Hall, and Alara woke with the memory of the whisper still pressed against her thoughts, refusing to fade the way ordinary dreams did. She dressed slowly, her hands unsteady as she fastened the buttons of her gown, replaying the sound behind the locked door again and again. A sigh, a drag of movement, words she could not catch, but words nonetheless, spoken by something that breathed. Whatever Alaric wished her to believe, that had not been the wind. Nora arrived with breakfast, and found Alara already seated at the small writing desk, staring at nothing. "You look tired, madam," Nora said carefully, setting down the tray. "I did not sleep well." Alara studied the girl's face, searching for any trace of the openness from the night before, but Nora's expression had closed again, guarded and careful. "Nora, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Madam, I already said what I—" "Not about the room." Alara softened her voice. "About me. Why does the Duke want me kept away? What have I done to earn such treatment before we've even shared a single meal together?" Nora's shoulders eased slightly at the change in question, though her eyes remained wary. "It isn't about you, madam, if it helps to hear it. I don't believe it ever was." "Then what is it about?" The girl hesitated, glancing toward the open door as she always did, and then said quietly, "The last lady who lived in this wing, she asked questions too. Too many questions, some said. And then one day she simply wasn't here anymore." Nora's hands twisted at her apron string. "I've said too much already. Please don't tell Mrs. Voss I spoke of it." "I won't," Alara promised, though the words offered little comfort against the chill spreading through her. After Nora left, Alara forced herself to eat, though the food sat heavy and tasteless in her stomach. She thought of her father's advice to be grateful, and wondered if he had known anything of this house before signing the papers that bound her to it. She doubted it. Her father was not a cruel man, only a desperate one, and desperation rarely paused to investigate the character of a duke offering to settle debts in exchange for a bride. She remembered the morning he had told her of the arrangement, how he had avoided her eyes and spoken quickly, as though speed might soften the blow of what he was asking her to accept. A duke had offered for her, sight unseen, through a solicitor and a stack of papers rather than a courtship of any kind. Her father had called it fortune. Alara, sitting now in a cold room in a forbidden wing, was beginning to suspect it had been something closer to a trade, though she could not yet guess what had truly been exchanged, or why a duke would need a bride so quickly and so quietly. A short while later, Margaret appeared at her door without knocking, her sharp eyes sweeping the room as though searching for evidence of some infraction. "You were seen in the library this morning," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I was reading," Alara answered carefully. "Is that forbidden as well?" "Nothing in this house is forbidden to its mistress, in principle." Margaret's mouth thinned. "In practice, it is wiser to stay where you are wanted. The library holds old family papers that are not meant for wandering eyes." "I saw nothing of consequence," Alara lied, keeping her voice steady. Margaret studied her a long moment, and Alara had the uncomfortable sense of being measured, weighed, and found wanting. "See that it stays that way," Margaret said finally, and left as abruptly as she had come, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound too careful to be anything but deliberate. Alara sat very still after she had gone, her heart beating too quickly. Margaret had not simply happened upon the knowledge of her morning in the library. Someone had told her, or watched, and reported back with a speed that suggested the house had eyes in every corner, whether Alara could see them or not. She spent the rest of the morning exploring what little of the house she was permitted to see, mapping the boundaries of her confinement. The east wing, she discovered, was entirely separate from the main house by a heavy door at its base, one that could be locked from either side. Today it stood unlocked, though she suspected that was more oversight than kindness. In the small library she found near the base of the stairs, tucked between shelves of dry legal volumes and older histories, she came across something unexpected, a stack of letters bound in faded ribbon, pushed carelessly behind a row of books as though someone had meant to burn them and forgotten. She should not have touched them. She knew this even as her fingers reached for the ribbon, some old propriety whispering that private letters were not hers to read. But the whisper behind the locked door was louder in her memory, and curiosity, once woken, did not easily return to sleep. The letters were addressed to someone named Alaric, though not in the cold, formal hand she might have expected from correspondence between strangers. These were intimate, warm, written by a woman who signed herself only as, "Your devoted wife." Alara's breath caught. The first Duchess. She read quickly, guiltily, aware of every creak of the old house around her. Most of the letters spoke of ordinary things, gardens and dinners and small complaints about the weather, but one, near the bottom of the stack, was different. The handwriting grew tighter, more urgent, as though written in haste or fear. I have found something in the ledgers that troubles me greatly, and I do not know who I can trust to help me understand it. Margaret grows strange whenever I mention the tenant accounts. I fear I have stumbled into something I was not meant to see, and I do not know what to do. If anything should happen to me, know that I did not simply take ill, whatever they may tell you. The letter ended there, unfinished, the final line trailing into a smudge of ink, as though the writer had been interrupted. Elara sat frozen, the paper trembling in her hands. Whatever she had imagined might explain the strangeness of this house. It had not been this. Not a woman who feared for her life, writing in secret, her fear preserved on paper and forgotten behind dusty books. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, and Elara shoved the letters back into their hiding place with clumsy haste, smoothing her skirts just as the library door opened. It was not Margaret, nor Alaric, but a man she had not yet met, tall and weathered, with the calloused hands of someone who worked the land rather than simply owned it. "Beg your pardon, my lady," he said, bowing slightly. "I did not know anyone was in here. I'm Nathaniel Cole, the estate steward. I only came to fetch the ledger books." "The ledger books," Elara repeated, her pulse quickening at the word. "Aye, my lady. The accounts for the tenant farms. The Duke likes them reviewed each season." Nathaniel's eyes flicked briefly to the shelf behind her, and something in his expression sharpened, though his voice remained even. "Is something troubling you, my lady?" "You look quite pale." "I am only tired," Elara said. "The house is not what I expected." Nathaniel studied her a moment longer than was strictly polite, and Elara had the distinct impression that he understood far more than he was saying. "Ashmore Hall keeps its own counsel, my lady, that is certain. If I may offer a word of advice, freely given and easily ignored." He lowered his voice slightly. "The western corridor of the east wing is best left alone. Whatever curiosity it stirs, it is not worth the answer it gives." "You know of the locked door, then?" Something flickered across his face, quick as it had with Nora, and just as quickly gone. "I know enough to say what I've said, my lady, and no more than that. Good day to you." He gathered the ledger books from a different shelf and left with the same measured calm he had entered with, leaving Elara alone with her racing thoughts and the letters still hidden behind the histories. She did not return to her rooms right away. Instead, she found herself walking the grounds, the wild garden Nora had mentioned stretching out beyond the terrace in tangled hedges and overgrown paths. The dry fountain stood at its center, cracked stone stained dark with years of neglect, and Elara ran her fingers along its edge, trying to piece together the fragments she had gathered. A dead duchess who had not simply taken ill, a locked room in a forbidden wing, a whisper that breathed, a steward who chose his words like a man walking across thin ice, careful of what lay beneath, and a duke who had looked, for one unguarded moment, more afraid than cold. She thought of Alaric's face in the corridor the night before, the rawness in his eyes before he hid it away again. Whatever was happening in this house, she no longer believed he was simply cruel. Cruel men did not look afraid when their secrets nearly slipped free. She lingered by the fountain longer than she meant to, watching a pair of sparrows settle briefly on its cracked rim, before darting off again into the gray afternoon. It struck her, standing there, that the garden must once have been beautiful. Someone had planted these hedges with care, had laid these stone paths in careful patterns now nearly swallowed by weeds. Someone had loved this place once, before whatever darkness had settled over it took hold. She wondered if that someone had been the first Duchess, and whether her hands had touched these very stones before her voice was silenced, one way or another, within these walls. A gardener, elderly and stooped, worked at a distant hedge, and Elara considered approaching him, then thought better of it. She had already asked too many questions of too many people in a single day, and word, she now understood, traveled quickly through this house regardless of who carried it. Better to gather what she could quietly, and reveal her hand to no one until she understood the game being played around her. She made her way back toward the house as the light began to fade, pausing once to look up at the east wing's windows from the outside. From here she could see the western corridor's shape clearly, a narrow stone addition that jutted slightly from the rest of the wing, its windows smaller and set with heavier bars than any other part of the house. It looked, from this angle, less like a bedroom and more like something built to contain rather than to comfort. The thought settled uneasily in her stomach as she climbed the terrace steps and let herself back inside. That evening, dinner was brought to her rooms as it had been the night before, and Alara ate alone by candlelight, listening to the wind press against the old windows. She thought of writing to Clara, her only true friend outside these walls, and after finishing her meal, she took out paper and ink and began. "Dearest Clara," she wrote, "I hardly know how to explain the situation I find myself in. I fear this marriage is not what either of us imagined, and I fear too that there is danger here I do not yet fully understand. I will write more when I know more. For now, only know that I am safe, though I do not know for how long that will remain true." She sealed the letter, intending to have Nora carry it to the post when the opportunity arose, and then, unable to help herself, she took out a second sheet of paper, blank and waiting, and began a different kind of record entirely. "Night 2, she wrote at the top, and beneath it, a careful accounting of everything she had seen and heard since arriving at Ashmore Hall. The locked door, the whisper, the letters hidden behind the histories, Nathaniel's warning, Alaric's fear. As she wrote, she found herself thinking of Alaric again, turning over the puzzle of him the way one might turn over a stone to see what moved beneath. A man who banished his bride to a forgotten wing, yet whose eyes had held such raw fear at the thought of her wandering too close to a locked door. A man whose first wife had died under circumstances she herself doubted enough to hide the truth in an unfinished letter. If Alaric had wished Alara harm, surely there had been easier ways to achieve it than marriage. He might have simply left her at her father's house, one more unwanted daughter among many, and never thought of her again. No, whatever kept Alaric distant, she was beginning to believe it was not indifference. It looked, more and more, like a man trying to keep a wall standing between herself and some danger he did not know how else to fight. Whether that made him a protector, or merely another piece of the mystery, she could not yet say. But it changed the shape of her fear, sharpening it into something closer to purpose. If there was a danger in this house, she would rather understand it than simply wait, trembling, for it to find her. She did not know yet how many nights this counting would demand of her, nor what waited at the number's end. But some instinct, quiet and certain, told her that counting mattered, that each night she survived within these walls was a night closer to understanding what had truly happened to the woman who had lived here before her, and what might yet be waiting to happen to Alara herself. Outside her window, the wind shifted, and somewhere far off in the house, so faint she could not be certain she had heard it at all, came the soft, distant sound of a door closing. She set down her pen and listened, but the house gave nothing more away that night, holding its secrets closed the way it had, she suspected, for a very long time before she had ever arrived to disturb them. By the 10th night, Alara had stopped pretending she would simply endure her circumstances, and started, quietly and carefully, to investigate them. She kept her journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard she had discovered near the hearth, its pages filling steadily with observations that seemed small alone but troubling together. The locked door remained locked. The whisper had not returned, though she found herself listening for it every night regardless, her ears straining against the silence until sleep finally claimed her. Nora grew more guarded with each visit, as though she regretted her earlier honesty and feared its consequences. Nathaniel, when their paths crossed, offered nothing further, though his eyes held a watchfulness that suggested he too was waiting for something. Margaret watched Alara now with open suspicion, finding reasons to appear in doorways at inconvenient moments, as though she sensed the current of curiosity running beneath Alara's careful composure. Alaric she saw rarely, and always briefly. He took his meals separately. He did not visit her chambers. On the few occasions their paths crossed in the main house, during her permitted hours beyond the east wing, he offered polite, empty words and little else, his eyes sliding away from hers as though even looking at her carried some risk he was unwilling to take. A letter had arrived from Clara 2 days earlier, smuggled to her through Nora's careful hands, and Alara had read it so many times the paper had begun to soften at its folds. "Alara, you must tell me plainly if you are in danger," Clara had written, her familiar impatient handwriting slanting hard across the page. "You are my dearest friend, and I will come to Ashmore Hall myself and demand answers if you do not write again soon with something more than vague warnings. I have made inquiries of my own here in town, quietly, and I have heard whispers that the first Duchess of Ashmore was not so ill as the family claimed. No one will say more than that, but I did not like the way the subject was avoided when I raised it at supper last week. Be careful, dearest. Trust no one fully until you understand this house better than it understands you." Alara had folded the letter away with trembling hands, Clara's warning settling alongside everything else she had gathered. It was one thing to suspect danger from within these walls, it was another to have it confirmed by whispers reaching all the way to town. Whispers that suggested the truth of the first Duchess's fate had never been entirely believed, even by those who had no connection to Ashmore Hall beyond idle gossip. She had written back that same night, keeping her words careful in case the letter should fall into the wrong hands. "I am safe for now," she wrote, "though I begin to understand there is more to this house than illness or misfortune. I will write again soon, and if my letters should stop coming, I trust you to remember everything I have already told you, and to act on it as you see fit." It was a grim sort of insurance, she knew, entrusting her friend with fragments of the truth in case the whole of it should be silenced before she could speak it herself. But it steadied her, somehow, knowing that someone beyond these walls held pieces of what she knew, someone who would ask questions loudly if Alara herself ever fell quiet. It was on the 10th night that Alara decided she could bear the not knowing no longer. She waited until the house had settled into its deepest silence, until even the distant creak of settling timber had gone still, and then she rose, dressed quickly in the dark, and took up her candle once more. The corridor felt different this time, not because anything had changed within it, but because she walked it now with purpose rather than mere curiosity. She reached the western turn without hesitation, her earlier fear folded away somewhere she could examine it later, and stood once more before the locked door with its heavy iron fittings. This time she brought with her a hairpin, an old trick she had learned from a groundskeeper's daughter during a childhood spent more often outdoors than in drawing rooms. Her fingers trembled as she worked it into the lock, more from cold than fear now, though fear had not entirely left her. The lock gave with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent corridor. Alara pushed the door open slowly, her candle throwing wavering light into a room that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not empty, as she had half expected, nor did it hold whatever prisoner her imagination had conjured over the past 10 nights. Instead, it held disturbance, overturned furniture, scattered papers across the floor, some torn, some simply scattered as though someone had searched through them in haste. A shattered mirror, its shards still glinting in the candlelight, scattered across a dressing table draped in dust. This had been a bedroom once, clearly a fine one, its furnishings finer than her own borrowed chamber, and it had been the scene of something violent, or at least something conducted in great haste and greater fear. Alara knelt among the scattered papers, careful of the broken glass, and began to read. Most were fragments, torn mid-sentence, but enough remained to piece together a picture. Ledgers, account books, references to tenant rents collected but never recorded in the estate's official books. A discrepancy, growing larger across several years, between what was taken from the land and what was reported to exist. Someone had been stealing from the estate, quietly, steadily, for years, and someone else had discovered it. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Alara spun, candle flame guttering wildly, to find Alaric standing in the doorway, his face illuminated in flickering gold and shadow, and this time there was no mistaking the emotion written plainly across it. It was not anger, though anger lived somewhere beneath it. It was fear, raw and unguarded, the same fear she had glimpsed once before and never fully understood. "I told you to stay away from this place," he said, his voice low and rough. "I found her letters, Alaric." Alara rose slowly, still holding the torn papers. "The first Duchess, she wrote that she found something wrong in the tenant accounts. She wrote that if anything happened to her, it would not have been simple illness, and now I stand in a room that looks as though something terrible happened here, surrounded by proof of exactly the fraud she described." Something in Alaric's expression cracked, just slightly, like ice under pressure. He crossed the room in a few swift strides and gripped her shoulders, not roughly, but with an intensity that startled her. "Do you understand what you are risking simply by knowing this?" he demanded. "Do you understand what happened to the last woman who stood in this room asking these questions?" "Then tell me," Alara said, refusing to look away from him despite the tremor in her own voice. "Tell me what happened to her. I am your wife, Alaric, whatever coldness you have shown me since my arrival. I deserve to know what danger I have married into." For a long moment he said nothing, his jaw working as though fighting some internal battle whose outcome he could not predict. Then, slowly, his grip on her shoulders loosened, though he did not step away. "She disappeared," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him something physical to speak. "My first wife. Not died, disappeared, from this very room, and I have spent 2 years since then telling this house and this world that she took ill, and passed quietly, because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud." Alara's heart pounded. "Dangerous how?" "Because whoever took her is still here," Alaric said. "Still within these walls, or close enough to reach them whenever they choose. I have spent 2 years searching quietly, trusting almost no one, terrified that if I moved too openly, whoever is responsible would simply vanish, and I would never learn the truth of what happened to her, or ensure it could not happen again. And so you married me, Alara said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, cold and sharp, and banished me the moment I arrived, to keep me away from whatever danger still lives in this house. I did not want a wife, Alaric said, and though the words might have wounded her once, spoken now they carried no cruelty, only a terrible weariness. My solicitors arranged the match to satisfy questions about succession that had grown too pointed to ignore any longer. I intended to keep you at arm's length, safe in the East Wing, uninvolved in a search I did not wish to endanger you with. I did not expect. He stopped himself, and Alara watched him retreat, visibly, back behind the wall he had built so carefully around himself. You did not expect what? She pressed. It does not matter, he said, releasing her shoulders entirely now, stepping back as though he had already said too much. What matters is that you leave this room, and this wing's western corridor, and never return to either. Whoever did this to Margaret's predecessor in this house's confidence, whoever stole from these lands and silenced my first wife to protect their theft, they are patient and they are careful. If they learn that you know what you now know, I cannot promise your safety. Margaret's predecessor, Alara repeated, catching the strange phrasing. You suspect someone close to the family then? Someone within this house? Alaric's silence was answer enough. Is it Margaret herself? Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, aware suddenly of how easily sound might carry through old stone walls. I do not know, Alaric admitted, and the admission seemed to pain him as much as anything he had said thus far. I have suspected everyone in this house at one point or another these past 2 years, including, God forgive me, myself, wondering if some blindness in my own character allowed this to happen beneath my very roof without my notice. I suspect Margaret because she alone has full access to the estate's older records, and because her behavior since my first wife's disappearance has grown increasingly strange, secretive in ways I cannot fully explain. But suspicion is not proof, and I have learned these past 2 years how dangerous it is to act without proof, in a house where the guilty party knows this land, these walls, and these secrets far better than I ever will. Alara looked down at the torn papers still clutched in her hand, then back at the ruined room around them, the shattered mirror, the overturned furniture, the ghost of violence that still seemed to hang in the air despite 2 years having passed. Then let me help you, she said. Absolutely not. Alaric's voice hardened again, the wall rebuilding itself brick by brick before her eyes. I have already lost one wife to this house's secrets. I will not lose a second. You will not lose me by allowing me to help you, Alara said, matching his intensity now with her own. You may lose me by continuing to shut me out, by leaving me alone in a wing where whispers move through locked doors and no one will tell me the truth of what surrounds me. I would rather face danger with understanding than safety built on ignorance, Alaric. If that frightens you, I am sorry for it, but I will not simply return to my rooms and forget what I have seen tonight. Something shifted in his expression, some barrier lowering fractionally, though whether from respect or simple exhaustion, Alara could not tell. We will speak of this again, he said finally, when there is less risk of being overheard. For tonight, return to your rooms and lock your door. Truly lock it, this time, and do not open it for anyone but Nora until morning. And you? I will secure this room again, and think on what you have said. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something almost like reluctant respect, or perhaps simply surprise at finding more courage in his new bride than he had anticipated. You are not at all what I expected, Alara Whitmore. Alara Grayson, she corrected quietly. Whatever this marriage has been thus far, I did make those vows beside you. He said nothing to that, but something in his face softened before he turned away, and Alara made her way back to her own chamber, with her heart pounding, and her mind racing through everything she had learned. A missing duchess, not dead but vanished. A theft hidden within tenant accounts. A suspect close enough to the family to move freely through its most private rooms, and a duke who had spent 2 years alone with this terrible knowledge, isolating himself as thoroughly as he had isolated her, out of a fear that trusting anyone might cost them their life. She locked her door as instructed and sat for a long while by her cold hearth, turning the torn papers over in her hands, memorizing what details she could before hiding them beneath the same loose floorboard that held her journal. As she worked, she thought again of the phrase Alaric had used, almost carelessly, in his exhaustion. Margaret's predecessor in this house's confidence. It suggested a role, a position of trust, rather than simply a family relation, and Alara turned the idea over carefully in her mind. Margaret managed the household accounts now, oversaw the staff, controlled who came and went from the family's private rooms. If the first Duchess had held some portion of that authority before her disappearance, and had used it to discover the fraud hidden in the tenant ledgers, then whoever had taken her authority afterward stood to gain a great deal from her silence, whether or not that same person had been responsible for silencing her directly. It was not proof. Alaric had been right about that much. But it was a thread, and threads, pulled carefully enough, had a way of unraveling far more than they first appeared to hold. She thought, too, of the strange softness that had crossed Alaric's face before he left her at her door, the way he had called her not at all what he expected, as though 2 years of isolation and suspicion had left him unprepared for a wife who refused simply to be managed and set aside. She did not know what to make of that softness, or of the small, unfamiliar warmth that had stirred in her own chest despite everything else occupying her thoughts. There would be time enough later to untangle her feelings toward the Duke she had married. For now, there was only the work in front of her, the papers to hide, the questions to weigh, and the long, careful nights still ahead. 20 nights remained by her count, though she no longer knew precisely what she was counting toward. When she had first begun marking each night in her journal, she had thought of it only as a record of endurance, a way of measuring how long this cold, strange marriage might continue before something changed one way or another. Now the counting felt different, sharper, less like waiting and more like preparation. Every night that passed was a night she gathered more understanding, moved closer to whatever truth waited at the heart of Ashmore Hall's silence. She only knew, with a certainty that settled deep and steady in her chest, that she would not simply wait quietly for those nights to pass. Whatever danger lived within Ashmore Hall's walls, whoever had silenced one Duchess and driven a grieving Duke into 2 years of isolated fear, she intended to help unmask it, whether her husband welcomed her help or not. She had come to this house a stranger, unwanted and dismissed. She did not intend to leave it, however this ended, having simply accepted that role without a fight. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the old window panes in their frames, and somewhere far below, faint enough that she almost missed it, she heard the sound of a door being carefully secured, iron against iron, and then footsteps retreating into silence. Alaric, she guessed, sealing the western room once more, standing guard over its secrets the way he had stood guard over his own grief for 2 long years. She blew out her candle and lay down at last, though sleep came slowly, tangled with images of torn ledgers and shattered mirrors, of a Duchess who had vanished rather than died, and of a Duke whose fear, she now understood, had never truly been about coldness at all. It had been about survival, hers and his both, in a house that had already taken one wife and seemed determined, in its silent and patient way, to see whether it might take another. She fell asleep, finally, with the loose floorboard secrets tucked safely beneath her, and dreamed, for the first time since her arrival, not of locked doors, but of Alaric's face in the candlelight, unguarded, calling her not at all what he expected, as though that surprise had been, in some small and complicated way, the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. 3 days passed before Alaric spoke to her again, and when he finally did, he came to her rooms himself, late in the evening, something he had never done before. Alara opened her door to find him standing in the corridor, a small wooden box tucked under one arm, his expression tired but resolved in a way that suggested he had made some decision he did not intend to reverse. "May I come in?" he asked, and the simple courtesy of the question, after weeks of cold commands, startled her more than she expected. Of course. She stepped aside, and he entered, setting the box on her writing desk with careful hands. "These belong to my first wife," he said, without preamble. "Margaret cleared her belongings shortly after the disappearance. Claimed she had burned most of it in grief on my behalf, though I never asked her to. I found this hidden in the estate office 3 days ago, behind a false panel I did not know existed until I went looking for it specifically." Alara opened the box slowly. Inside lay a small collection of items, a ring, plain and unadorned, a folded handkerchief embroidered with initials that did not match Margaret's name, and a slim, leather-bound book that turned out, when Alara opened it, to be a private diary. "You have read this," Alara said, looking up at him. "I have," Alaric admitted. "Twice through, searching for anything useful. I found nothing conclusive, only more confirmation of what her letters already suggested." She grew increasingly certain that someone within the household was falsifying the tenant accounts, skimming income before it ever reached the official ledgers. In her final entries, she wrote that she intended to confront Margaret directly, having narrowed her suspicion to her alone. And then she disappeared, Alara finished quietly. 3 days after that final entry, yes. Alaric's jaw tightened. I have suspected Margaret for 2 years, Alara. But suspicion built on an unfinished diary and a woman's private fears is not enough to accuse a member of my own family, particularly not one who has served this household faithfully for over 20 years, before whatever happened. I need proof, something beyond speculation. Alara turned the diary's pages carefully, her eyes catching on a passage near the end. I begin to fear I have made a terrible mistake in trusting Margaret with everything I discovered, the entry read. She grows evasive whenever I press for explanations, and last evening I found her going through my private correspondence when she believed me elsewhere in the house. I do not know what to do. Alaric is often away on estate business these weeks, and I fear confronting her alone, yet I trust no other member of this household enough to seek their help. She was afraid to trust anyone, Alara murmured, just as you have been these 2 years. With good reason, it seems. Alaric's voice carried a bitterness that had nothing to do with Alara and everything to do with his own long isolation. I built walls around myself after she vanished, told myself that trusting no one was the only way to keep whoever was responsible from realizing I still searched for the truth. I told myself the same walls would protect you, if I kept you far enough removed from the search entirely. And yet here you are, Alara said, sharing her diary with me regardless. Something almost like a smile touched his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. You broke into a locked room with a hairpin, and confronted me over the wreckage inside it, without so much as a tremor in your voice, Alara. I begin to think keeping you removed from this was never truly an option, whatever I told myself these past weeks. Alara felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unexpected and unwelcome given the gravity of their conversation, and turned her attention back to the diary to hide it. We need proof then, something that ties Margaret directly to the falsified accounts, or to your first wife's disappearance itself. Nathaniel has begun quietly reviewing the older tenant ledgers against the estate's tax records, Alaric said. If money was taken over several years, there should be some discrepancy between what tenants report paying and what the estate's official books show as received. It is slow work, and dangerous, if Margaret suspects what he searches for. Can he be trusted? He is the only person in this house I have trusted these 2 years, Alaric said. His own father served as steward before him, and there is a loyalty in that family to this land that runs deeper than loyalty to any single member of the family that owns it. He came to me himself, shortly after my first wife's disappearance, and told me quietly that he did not believe the story of her illness. I have relied on his discretion ever since. Alara closed the diary gently and set it back in its box. Then let me help as well. I can watch Margaret in ways neither you nor Nathaniel can, precisely because she believes me foolish and harmless. She speaks more freely around me than she likely does around either of you, dismissing me as beneath her notice. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something conflicted working behind his eyes. If she suspects for even a moment that you are gathering information against her, Alara, I cannot promise your safety. I could not protect my first wife from whatever this house's silence allowed to happen to her. I do not know that I could protect you either, however much I might wish to. Then we will be careful, Alara said. But I will not simply sit in this room counting nights, while you and Nathaniel risk everything alone. I married into this house's dangers as surely as I married into its title, Alaric. Let me carry some portion of the weight. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had softened into something Alara had not yet heard from him, something closer to the man he might have been before grief and suspicion hardened him into cold formality. My father chose this match for reasons of debt and convenience, and I resented it bitterly when the arrangements were finalized. I resented you, unfairly, for weeks after your arrival, blaming you for circumstances entirely beyond your control simply because your presence forced me to confront how thoroughly I had isolated myself. I am sorry for that, Alara. You deserved better welcome than I gave you. You believed you were protecting me, Alara said. I understand that now, even if I did not at first. That does not excuse the coldness, Alaric said, but I hope, in time, I might earn the chance to offer something better than what I have given you thus far. They spoke for another hour that evening, longer than they had spoken in the entire time since her arrival, piecing together everything they each knew, comparing the fragments of letters and diary entries and Nathaniel's careful observations into something that almost, though not quite, resembled a full picture. Margaret's increasing control over household accounts following the first Duchess's disappearance, her sharp reaction whenever tenant income was discussed, the strange, sealed room in the western corridor that she alone, besides Alaric, held a key to. When Alaric finally rose to leave, near midnight, he paused at the door and looked back at her, with an expression she was beginning to recognize, though she could not yet name it fully. 23 nights, he said quietly. I have heard from Nora that you count them in a journal. Alara flushed, surprised he knew of her private record. I did not think anyone paid attention to what I did in these rooms. I pay more attention than I have allowed myself to show, Alaric admitted. I find, now, that I am curious what the counting means to you. At first, only endurance, Alara said honestly. Now, something closer to hope, I think, that each night brings us closer to understanding, and to safety, rather than simply further from where I began. Alaric held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed ready to name aloud, and then he inclined his head and left her alone with the diary, the box, and a hope she had not expected to feel so strongly in a house that had, until recently, felt only like a beautifully furnished prison. The next afternoon, Alara put their plan into careful motion for the first time. She found Margaret in the small sitting room where the household accounts were kept, bent over a ledger with a look of practiced concentration, and rather than retreating as she might have days earlier, Alara entered and settled herself into a chair near the window, feigning an interest in needlework she had brought along for precisely this purpose. You seem to have found your feet in this house, Margaret observed, not looking up from her ledger. I confess I expected more tears from you by now, more letters home begging your father to intervene. I am made of sturdier stuff than that, Alara said lightly, keeping her eyes on her stitching. Besides, I find the house grows on me the longer I stay. There is a great deal of history here, is there not? I noticed, in the library, quite a collection of old family papers. Margaret's pen paused, only briefly, before resuming its careful movement across the page. This family has occupied Ashmore Hall for 6 generations. There is history enough to fill a dozen libraries, if one had the patience to sort through it. I imagine managing so much history falls largely to you, Alara said. The Duke seems to trust you a great deal with the household's affairs. Someone must manage them, Margaret said, particularly in a house that has seen more than its share of misfortune these past years. Her eyes flicked up, sharp and assessing. You ask a great many questions for a woman who claims only passing interest in old family papers. Alara kept her expression carefully mild, forcing her hands to remain steady on her needlework despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. I only wish to understand my new home, and the people who have cared for it so long before my arrival. Is that so unusual a wish? Unusual, perhaps not, Margaret said, returning her attention to the ledger, though something in her posture had stiffened that had not been there before. Unwise, in certain matters, most certainly. This house keeps its secrets close for good reason, Mrs. Grayson. I would advise you not to go digging for them simply out of idle curiosity. Is that a warning? Alara asked, keeping her tone light despite the chill the words sent through her. Call it experience, Margaret said. The last woman who occupied your rooms grew far too curious for her own good, and see where such curiosity led her. She closed the ledger with a decisive snap. I would not wish the same fate upon you, whatever coldness has passed between yourself and my nephew thus far. The threat, veiled as it was in the language of concern, settled heavily in Alara's chest as Margaret rose and left the room without further explanation, her footsteps brisk and purposeful down the corridor. Alara sat very still for several minutes afterward, her needlework forgotten in her lap, replaying the exchange in her mind and searching for anything useful within it. Margaret had all but confirmed she knew more about the first Duchess's fate than she had ever admitted publicly. Whether that knowledge stemmed from guilt or simply proximity to whatever had truly happened, Alara could not yet say, but the warning itself, however carefully phrased, told her something important. Margaret was watching her closely, and had been, perhaps, since the very morning of her arrival. She reported the exchange to Alaric that evening, finding him waiting in the small library after the household had settled for the night, and watched his expression darken as she recounted Margaret's words. She threatened you, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. She warned me, Alara corrected gently, though she understood his fear well enough. There is a difference, however narrow, and it tells us something, Alaric. She would not warn me so pointedly, if she had nothing to fear from my curiosity. Nathaniel joined them shortly after, slipping into the library with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to moving unseen through the house he served. He carried a slim folder of papers, his expression grim. I have found the beginning of what we sought, he said, setting the folder on the table between them. 3 years of discrepancy between the tenant rolls and the estate's official income records, small at first, easily dismissed as clerical error, but growing steadily each year. By my calculation, someone has diverted a considerable sum from this estate, funneled through accounts that lead back, eventually, to transactions Margaret herself authorized. Ilara and Alaric exchanged a look heavy with the weight of confirmation neither had truly wanted, despite months and years of suspicion pointing toward exactly this conclusion. It is not yet proof enough to accuse her outright, Nathaniel cautioned. The authorizations could be explained, if pressed, as routine estate business. We need something more direct, some connection between these financial discrepancies and what happened to your first wife specifically, Your Grace, before we move against her openly. Then we continue searching, Alaric said, his voice hardening with renewed resolve, carefully and quietly, as we have thus far. But we are close now, closer than I have been in 2 years of searching alone. He looked at Ilara as he spoke, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with ledgers or accounts, something that felt, despite the danger surrounding them, dangerously close to hope. She did not sleep for some time after that evening's revelations, turning over everything they had discussed, but for the first time since her arrival at Ashmore Hall, the wakefulness that kept her from rest was not fear alone. It was something closer to purpose, sharpened now by partnership rather than isolation, and beneath that purpose, quiet and unacknowledged, something that felt dangerously close to affection for a husband she had believed, only weeks before, might never look at her with anything warmer than cold necessity. The nights that followed passed in careful, quiet work, each one bringing Ilara, Alaric, and Nathaniel closer to a truth that seemed to circle always just beyond their reach, like a shape glimpsed in fog. By the 25th night, Nathaniel had traced the diverted funds through 3 separate accounts, each more carefully concealed than the last, all of them eventually leading back to a single name that appeared nowhere in the official estate records but surfaced repeatedly in private correspondence Nathaniel had uncovered among old shipping manifests kept in the estate office. A man named Edmund Foss, listed once, briefly, as a distant cousin of Margaret's late husband, who had visited Ashmore Hall several times in the years before the first Duchess's disappearance, and never again afterward. He managed a shipping concern out of Bristol, Nathaniel explained one evening, spreading the manifests across the library table for Alaric and Ilara to examine. Or claimed to. My inquiries suggest the concern itself barely existed beyond a name and a rented office, useful chiefly, I suspect, for moving stolen income somewhere it could not easily be traced back to this estate. And Margaret's connection to him? Alaric asked, though his tightening jaw suggested he already feared the answer. More than distant family, Your Grace, if the tone of these letters is any indication. Nathaniel produced a final paper, worn soft from handling, and set it before them. I found this hidden with the shipping manifests. I believe Mrs. Voss did not intend for it to survive this long. Ilara read it quickly, her stomach tightening with each line. The letter, unsigned but clearly written in a hand Ilara now recognized from countless household notes and instructions, spoke openly of continuing arrangements, of income that must be moved carefully to avoid suspicion, and of a problem that required handling before it grew any larger. The letter was dated only days before the first Duchess's disappearance. A problem that required handling, Alaric repeated quietly, his voice carrying a barely restrained fury Ilara had not yet heard from him. My wife discovered the theft, confronted Margaret directly as her diary suggested she intended to, and Margaret arranged to have the problem removed entirely. We still lack proof of what happened to her specifically, Nathaniel cautioned, though even he could not keep the grim certainty from his own voice. This letter proves theft, and perhaps intent to silence her through some means. It does not yet prove what that silencing ultimately involved, nor where it might lead us now. Ilara set the letter down carefully, her mind already working through the implications. Margaret grows suspicious of me. She warned me plainly enough days ago that curiosity in this house carries consequences. If she believes we are close to uncovering the truth, she may act again, and quickly, to protect herself. Then we must move first, Alaric said, carefully, but without further delay. They spent the remainder of that night planning, weighing options that ranged from confronting Margaret directly, risking her simply fleeing before facing consequence, to involving the local magistrate immediately, risking that insufficient proof might allow her to talk her way free of suspicion entirely, protected by her long service to the family and her practiced composure. It was Ilara who suggested, finally, the plan that would carry them into the story's most dangerous night. Let her believe I have found something specific, she said. Something that connects Edmund Foss directly to whatever happened to the first Duchess. If she believes I hold proof that could destroy her, she may act rashly, and rash action leaves evidence that careful planning does not. Absolutely not, Alaric said immediately. I will not use you as bait for a woman who has already proven herself capable of arranging someone's disappearance. I would not be bait so much as opportunity, Alara argued. You and Nathaniel would watch closely, ready to act the moment she reveals herself. It is far more dangerous to continue waiting, hoping she does not grow desperate enough to act against one of us regardless, than to control the moment ourselves and force her hand while we are prepared for it. The argument continued late into the night, Alaric's fear for her safety warring visibly with the growing recognition that Alara's instincts, thus far, had proven sound at every turn. In the end, it was Nathaniel who offered a compromise, a plan that would allow Alara to draw Margaret's suspicion without placing herself entirely alone in danger. Alaric and Nathaniel positioned close enough to intervene the moment circumstances required it. The 2 nights before her confrontation with Margaret passed slowly, each hour stretched thin with anticipation. On the 26th night, Alara sat with Alaric in the library long after the rest of the household had retired, reviewing every detail of their plan, until the words began to blur together from repetition. You do not have to do this, Alaric said again, for perhaps the 3rd time that evening, his hand resting near hers on the table though he did not quite touch her. We could take what we have to the magistrate now, incomplete as it is, and let the law take its slower, safer course. And risk Margaret fleeing before the law can act at all, Alara said gently. You know as well as I do that incomplete proof gives her every opportunity to talk her way free, or worse, to disappear entirely before anyone can hold her accountable. She has had 2 years to prepare for exactly this possibility. I know, Alaric's jaw tightened. I simply find, now that I have allowed myself to care for your safety as more than simple duty, that the prospect of risking it frightens me more than anything Margaret might have done to me directly. The admission hung between them, quiet and unexpected, and Alara felt her breath catch at the rare openness in his voice. You have grown careful with your words around me, she said softly. Careful in a different way than before, not guarded exactly, something gentler. I did not expect to find myself caring for the wife circumstance forced upon me, Alaric admitted. I expected, if anything, years of polite distance, a marriage in name only, sufficient to satisfy questions of succession and little else. I did not expect courage like yours, nor the particular ache of fearing for someone else's safety more than my own. Alara said nothing for a long moment, letting the weight of his words settle between them, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth she had not allowed herself to fully express since her arrival at Ashmore Hall. Whatever this marriage began as, Alaric, I no longer wish for polite distance either. Let us survive what is coming, and speak more of this once Margaret's secrets are finally laid bare. He held her gaze a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, before Nathaniel's return to the library interrupted the quiet with fresh details of the plan's final arrangements, and the 2 of them returned, reluctantly, to the careful business of preparing for danger. The 27th night passed in similar tension, Alara rehearsing her approach to Margaret, until the false claim of evidence sent to a solicitor felt almost true in her own mind, a necessary fiction she would need to deliver with complete conviction, if their plan held any hope of success. On the 28th night, Alara made her move. She approached Margaret in the small sitting room once more, this time carrying, quite visibly, a folded paper she had prepared herself, its contents a careful fabrication suggesting she had found direct evidence connecting Edmund Foss to the first Duchess's disappearance, evidence she claimed to have already sent, in duplicate, to a solicitor in town for safekeeping. I thought you should know, Alara said, watching Margaret's face carefully as she spoke, that I intend to bring what I have found to the Duke tomorrow morning, along with the magistrate. I thought it only fair to give you the chance to prepare yourself, given your long service to this family, before matters proceed further. Margaret's composure did not crack entirely, but something shifted behind her eyes, calculation replacing the practiced blankness she had maintained throughout Alara's residence at Ashmore Hall. You are playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Grayson, meddling in matters you do not fully understand. I understand enough, Alara said steadily, despite the pounding of her own heart. I understand that a woman is missing, that money has been stolen from tenants who can ill afford the loss, and that someone in this household arranged both circumstances for their own gain. You understand nothing of what this family has endured, Margaret said, and for the first time, real emotion broke through her careful control, something that might have been grief tangled inextricably with guilt. You think it's simple, do you? A wicked woman stealing coin for her own comfort? I did what I did to protect this family from ruin, from debts that would have seen this estate sold to strangers within a single generation, if I had not found some way to manage them quietly. By stealing from the very tenants this estate is meant to protect, Ilara said. By silencing anyone who threatened to expose you, regardless of what that silencing required. Margaret's face went pale, then hardened into something colder than Ilara had yet seen from her. You know nothing of what was required. You know nothing of what I have sacrificed to keep this family standing, and I will not allow you, some penniless bride bought to solve a succession problem, to undo 2 decades of careful protection with reckless curiosity. She left the room abruptly, her composure fractured but not entirely broken, and Ilara sat for a long moment afterward, her hands trembling now that the confrontation had passed, understanding with cold certainty that she had pushed Margaret exactly to the edge they had hoped for. That night, Ilara returned to her chamber as usual, though sleep felt impossible with the tension of the day still coursing through her. She had barely settled into bed when she heard it, footsteps in the corridor outside her door, careful and deliberate, followed by the soft, metallic sound of someone testing her lock. Her heart lurched into her throat. According to their plan, Alaric and Nathaniel waited in the adjoining chamber, close enough to hear any disturbance, but the footsteps outside her door moved on after a moment, continuing down the corridor rather than attempting her chamber directly. Ilara rose silently and pressed her ear to the door, straining to follow the sound. The footsteps seemed to head toward the western corridor, toward the locked room that had started this entire investigation. Against every instinct toward caution, she opened her door as quietly as she could manage and followed, her candle unlit, trusting instead to the faint moonlight filtering through the corridor's narrow windows. She reached the western turn in time to see Margaret's shadow disappearing into the sealed room, a lantern's glow spilling briefly into the corridor before the door swung nearly shut behind her. Ilara crept closer, close enough to hear movement within, papers being gathered hastily, drawers pulled open and searched. Margaret was destroying evidence, or perhaps gathering what remained to flee entirely before morning brought the magistrate Ilara had claimed to be summoning. Ilara turned to fetch Alaric and Nathaniel, but before she had taken more than a few steps, a hand closed around her arm, sharp and sudden, pulling her backward into the shadowed doorway of the sealed room. "I thought you might come," Margaret said, her lantern light throwing harsh shadows across a face that had abandoned all pretense of warmth now, revealing something desperate and dangerous beneath the years of careful composure. "Clever of you, drawing me out like this. Foolish, too, coming here alone." "I am not alone," Ilara said, though her voice wavered despite her effort to steady it. "No?" Margaret's grip tightened. "Then where precisely is your Duke, Mrs. Grayson? Where is your loyal steward, ready to leap to your rescue? I see only you, and only darkness, and a house old enough to keep whatever secrets it is given, one way or another." Fear closed cold fingers around Ilara's throat, but beneath the fear, something steadier held firm, the knowledge that she had not, in fact, come entirely unprepared. She had insisted, against Alaric's initial reluctance, that a signal be arranged between them, a particular knock against the shared wall between her chamber and the room where he waited, should anything go wrong during her approach to Margaret. She had not yet had the chance to use it. "You are correct that I came ahead of them," Ilara said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite Margaret's grip, "but they know precisely where I intended to go tonight, and precisely how long to wait before following. That time, Margaret, has very nearly run out." Something flickered across Margaret's face, doubt mingling uneasily with the desperation already there, and in that moment of hesitation, footsteps sounded at last in the corridor beyond, quick and heavy, and Alaric's voice rang out, sharp with fear and fury both. "Ilara!" Margaret's grip loosened in her surprise, just enough, and Ilara wrenched herself free, stumbling backward into the corridor as Alaric rounded the western turn with Nathaniel close behind him, both men's faces stark with alarm at finding her so close to danger. But Margaret did not simply surrender. In the chaos of the moment, she seized the lantern from its hook and flung it toward the papers scattered across the room's dressing table, flames catching instantly against dry, brittle documents that had waited 2 years to reveal their secrets. "If I fall," Margaret said, her voice ragged now, stripped of all its former composure, "this house falls with me. Let it burn, along with whatever proof you think you have found." Nathaniel lunged past her toward the growing flames, beating at them with a heavy curtain torn hastily from its rod, while Alaric caught Margaret's arm before she could flee entirely, his face a mask of controlled fury that Ilara had never seen from him before. "It ends tonight, Margaret," he said, his voice low and final. Whatever you have done, whatever you believe you were protecting, it ends here, now, and you will answer for all of it, beginning with what truly happened to my first wife. Margaret's resistance crumbled all at once, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had flared, leaving behind only exhaustion and something that might, in another woman, have been relief at finally setting down a burden carried too long in secret. She is not dead, Margaret said quietly, as Nathaniel finally smothered the last of the flames, the room filled now with smoke and the acrid smell of scorched paper. I could not bring myself to go that far, whatever else I have done. She lives still, Alaric, though not here, and not under circumstances either of you will find easy to hear. Alive, Alaric repeated, his voice barely a whisper, as though he feared speaking the word too loudly might shatter its fragile truth. 2 years, Margaret. 2 years I have grieved her, searched for her, told this entire house and everyone beyond it that she had died of illness, and you allowed me to carry that grief when she lived still. I could not risk her return, Margaret said, sinking now into a chair near the ruined dressing table, her earlier fury spent entirely, leaving only a tired, hollow honesty behind it. Not once she knew what she knew. I paid to have her taken somewhere far from here, somewhere she could not easily find her way back, and I told myself it was mercy, that I had spared her worse than what circumstance nearly demanded of me that night. I do not expect either of you to forgive that choice. I am not certain I have forgiven it myself. Alara watched Alaric absorb this, watched the storm of emotions crossing his face, grief and fury and a desperate dawning hope all tangled together, and understood that whatever came next in this unraveling story, it would ask more of him than anger alone. Where is she? Alaric demanded. Tell me exactly where, Margaret, and hold nothing back this time. Margaret's hollow gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time since the confrontation began, something like genuine remorse flickered across her tired features. A house near the northern coast, kept under a false name these 2 years, guarded loosely enough that I told myself she might have escaped if she truly wished it, though I know now that was only another lie I told myself to bear what I had done. I will tell you everything, Alaric. The address, the arrangements, all of it. I am tired of carrying this alone. The night's danger had passed, but as Alara stood trembling in the ruined room, ash settling across the floor where evidence had so nearly been destroyed entirely, she understood that the truth Margaret was finally prepared to reveal would prove far more complicated and far more painful than any of them had yet allowed themselves to imagine. A missing duchess, alive after all, waited somewhere beyond these walls, and the final nights of Alara's strange, cold marriage were about to become something else entirely, a race against time to bring the truth, and a lost woman, home at last. Margaret was confined to a locked room under Nathaniel's watch that same night, and by morning, the magistrate had been summoned in truth, no longer a fiction invented to draw out a confession, but a necessary next step in unraveling everything that had happened at Ashmore Hall. Alaric barely slept. Alara found him at dawn in the estate office, poring over the address Margaret had finally provided. A house near a small fishing village along the northern coast, some 3 days' hard travel from Ashmore Hall. I intend to leave within the hour, he said, not looking up from the papers spread before him. I will not wait a single day longer than necessary to bring her home. I am coming with you, Alara said. He looked up then, his expression torn between the fierce protectiveness she had come to recognize and something that looked almost like relief at not having to face this journey entirely alone. Alara, I do not know what we will find there. 2 years is a long time. She may not be the woman I remember. She may not wish to return at all, given what was done to her. All the more reason you should not face it alone, Alara said gently. Whatever we find, Alaric, you will need someone beside you who is not tangled up in your own grief and guilt over what happened. Let me be that person. He did not argue further, and within the hour, the two of them set out with Nathaniel driving the carriage himself, trusting the delicate matter to no other hands. The journey passed in tense, exhausted silence for the most part, broken occasionally by Alaric's restless attempts to prepare himself for whatever awaited them, and Alara's quiet efforts to steady him, each time his composure threatened to crack under the weight of hope and dread combined. They arrived at the small coastal village on the evening of the second day. Earlier than expected, the horses pushed harder than was entirely wise in their shared urgency to reach the address Margaret had provided. The house itself sat isolated at the edge of the village, small and weathered by sea wind, nothing like the grand halls of Ashmore. A woman answered the door when they knocked, and Alara watched Alaric's face transform entirely at the sight of her. grief and hope and disbelief crashing together in an expression she suspected she would remember for the rest of her life. "Margaret sent you," the woman said, before Alaric could speak at all, her voice wary but not entirely surprised. "I wondered, these past months, whether she would ever find the courage." "Charlotte," Alaric said, and the name broke from him like something long held prisoner finally released. "Charlotte, I believed you dead. 2 years, I believed I had lost you." The first Duchess, whose name Alara now finally learned, studied him for a long, careful moment, her expression guarded in a way that told its own story of 2 years spent in isolation and uncertainty, before something in her posture eased, just slightly. "I did not know what you had been told," Charlotte said. "I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that you searched for me still, though as the months passed, I began to fear you had simply accepted whatever explanation Margaret offered and moved forward without me." "I never stopped searching," Alaric said. "I married again, Charlotte, believing you gone, believing the succession demanded it, but I never stopped believing something was wrong with the story I had been given." Alara watched this exchange with a complicated tangle of emotions she had not fully anticipated. Relief at finding the missing Duchess alive, warring with a quieter, more painful uncertainty about what her own place in this unfolding reunion might now become. She had grown these past weeks to care for Alaric in ways she had not expected when she first arrived at Ashmore Hall as a stranger. Watching him now, reunited with the wife he had genuinely loved and lost, she felt that fragile hope tremble uncertainly within her chest. Charlotte's eyes moved to Alara then, taking in her presence with evident curiosity. "And who is this?" "My wife," Alaric said, and something in his voice, some careful hesitation, suggested he too was navigating waters he had not prepared for. "Alara. She is the one who uncovered the truth of what Margaret had done, who refused to let the matter rest despite every danger involved in pursuing it." Charlotte studied Alara with new interest, something thoughtful replacing the initial wariness in her expression. "Then I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay, Alara. 2 years, and I had nearly given up hope that anyone would come looking, let alone find the courage to bring the truth into the light." They spoke long into the night, gathered around a small fire in the modest cottage, piecing together the full account of what had happened. Charlotte had confronted Margaret directly, exactly as her diary suggested she intended, and Margaret, panicked and desperate to protect both her theft and the family name she had convinced herself she was preserving, had arranged for Charlotte to be taken from Ashmore Hall entirely, spirited away under threat and false promises, told that any attempt to return or reveal the truth would see her family, still living nearby, suffer for her defiance. "I stayed silent to protect them," Charlotte said quietly. "My parents, my younger sister. Margaret made it clear enough what might happen to them if I tried to expose what I knew, or attempted to return home. I did not know, until tonight, whether that threat still held any weight, or whether 2 years of silence had been for nothing at all." "It will hold no weight any longer," Alaric said, fierce and certain. "Margaret is confined already, awaiting the magistrate's full inquiry. Whatever threats she made, she no longer holds any power to enforce them." The complicated question of what came next hung unspoken between the three of them for the remainder of that night, none of them quite ready to address it directly amid the exhaustion and relief of the reunion itself. They began the journey back to Ashmore Hall the following morning, Charlotte joining them in the carriage, and it was during this long return journey that Alara finally found herself alone with Charlotte for a stretch of quiet hours, while Alaric rode ahead briefly to arrange fresh horses at a coaching inn. "You love him," Charlotte said, without preamble, studying Alara with the same thoughtful directness she had shown the night before. "I saw it plainly enough last evening, in the way you watched him, in the careful distance you kept even as everything in your posture wished to close it." Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unable to fully deny what Charlotte had so easily observed. "It does not matter now, surely. You are his wife. You were always his wife, in truth, whatever papers were signed in your absence." "Was I?" Charlotte's expression grew thoughtful, tinged with something that might have been sorrow, though not entirely the sorrow Alara expected. 2 years is a long time, Alara. I grieved my old life fiercely at first, grieved Alaric, grieved everything Margaret's cruelty took from me. But grief changes, given enough time and distance. I built something of a life in that village, however small and constrained by fear. I am not certain the marriage I return to now is the same marriage I left behind, nor that I wish it to be." "What are you saying?" Alara asked carefully. "I am saying that I did not spend these 2 years pining for a return to exactly what came before," Charlotte said. "I returned because the truth deserves to be known, because Margaret deserves to answer for what she did, and because my family deserves to know I live, after 2 years of believing otherwise. But Alaric, and Ashmore Hall, and the particular life of a duchess I once occupied so completely, that is a different question entirely, one I have not yet fully answered even for myself. Alara said nothing for a long moment, turning Charlotte's words over carefully, unwilling to hope too readily for something that still felt entirely uncertain. Whatever you decide, Charlotte, I hope you will take whatever time you need to decide it honestly, without pressure from anyone, myself included. That is kindly said, Charlotte replied, particularly from a woman whose own happiness stands to be shaped by whatever I decide. She studied Alara a moment longer. You are not at all what I expected. When Margaret first mentioned a new bride had come to Ashmore Hall in my absence. So I have been told, Alara said, a small, tired smile finding its way onto her face despite everything. They arrived back at Ashmore Hall on the 30th night since Alara's original arrival, though she barely registered the significance of the count amid everything else occupying her thoughts. The household staff, informed only that the Duke had traveled urgently and returned with unexpected news, gathered in stunned, disbelieving silence as Charlotte stepped down from the carriage into the torchlit courtyard, very much alive, very much returned from whatever fate they had been told had claimed her. The following days passed in a whirlwind of necessary business. The magistrate conducted his inquiry into Margaret's affairs, the full extent of her theft and deception laid bare through Nathaniel's careful documentation and Charlotte's own testimony. Edmund Foss was located and apprehended within the week, his shipping concern exposed as the hollow front it had always been. Margaret herself, stripped of any authority within the household, awaited formal judgment with a weary resignation that suggested she had, in some private way, been waiting for this reckoning for 2 long years already. And through it all, Alaric and Charlotte spent long hours in careful private conversation, working through the complicated tangle of a marriage interrupted so violently and for so long. Margaret's formal judgment came on a gray morning that felt fitting for the occasion, the local magistrate presiding over a quiet hearing held at Ashmore Hall itself rather than the public courthouse, a small mercy Alaric had arranged in recognition of Margaret's decades of otherwise faithful service before her final, devastating betrayal. Ilara attended alongside Alaric, watching as the woman who had once dismissed her so thoroughly stood now stripped of all her former authority, her posture bent with an exhaustion that seemed to have aged her considerably in the span of a single week. I do not ask for mercy, Margaret said, when finally given the chance to speak in her own defense. I know what I have done, and I know it cannot be undone or fully forgiven, whatever reasons I told myself justified it at the time. I ask only that the household staff who served me these years, who knew nothing of what I concealed from them, not suffer for my choices in any judgment that follows. Alaric's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the proceedings, though Alara, standing close beside him, felt the tension in his hand where it rested near her own, grief and fury still warring beneath his composed exterior. The magistrate's judgment, when it finally came, saw Margaret stripped of any remaining claim to the estate and confined to a modest property some distance from Ashmore Hall, her movements restricted and monitored, spared the harsher punishment her crimes might otherwise have warranted, only through Charlotte's own quiet plea for leniency, a mercy that struck Alara as remarkable, given everything Charlotte herself had suffered. I do not forgive her, Charlotte explained afterward, when Alara asked about the plea. I do not know that I ever will, fully. But 2 years in isolation taught me something about the cost of bitterness, carried too long and too heavily. I would rather she live long enough to understand what she has lost, than see her punished so severely that understanding becomes impossible. Edmund Foss received harsher judgment, his fraudulent shipping concern dismantled entirely, and his own freedom forfeited for a considerable term, the full weight of the law applied without the tempering influence of decades of family loyalty that had softened Margaret's sentence. Nathaniel's careful documentation proved instrumental throughout, and Alaric made clear, in the weeks that followed, that the steward's discretion and loyalty would be rewarded with expanded responsibility and trust across the estate's management, a fitting conclusion to 2 years of quiet, careful service. The household staff, once so guarded and fearful in Alara's presence, began slowly to warm toward her as the full truth of her role in uncovering Margaret's deception spread through careful, respectful whispers. Nora, in particular, sought her out one afternoon with an apology that Alara gently waved away. You owe me nothing, Nora, Alara said. You risked a great deal simply speaking as honestly as you did, that first night I arrived. I have not forgotten it. I only wish I had trusted you sooner, madam, Nora said. might have spared everyone a great deal of fear had I spoken more plainly from the start. We none of us knew, at the start, how this would end, Elara said. I do not think you owe yourself blame for caution, in a house that had already taught everyone within it how dangerous curiosity could be. It was against this backdrop of slowly settling peace, the household finding its footing again after 2 years of buried secrets finally brought into the light, that Charlotte herself finally resolved the question, calling both Alaric and Elara together in the library one evening, a week after her return, her expression calm and resolved in a way that suggested careful, honest consideration rather than hasty decision. I do not wish to return to the life of Duchess of Ashmore, she said plainly, not because I bear either of you any ill will, but because these 2 years changed me in ways I cannot simply set aside to resume exactly where circumstance interrupted me. I wish to see my family again, to rebuild what connection I can with them, and then, I think, to build a smaller, quieter life of my own choosing, free of titles and estates and the particular dangers that come with them. Charlotte, Alaric began, though she raised a gentle hand to stop him. I am not asking your permission, Alaric, nor your forgiveness for feeling this way. I am telling you, as honestly as I can, what I have decided after a great deal of careful thought. I loved you once, deeply, and some part of that love remains, though changed by everything that has happened since. But I do not love the life we shared enough to return to it entirely, and I think, watching the two of you these past days, that a different happiness has already begun to take root here regardless. She looked pointedly between Alaric and Elara as she spoke, and Elara felt her breath catch at the plain, generous honesty of the observation. With the proper legal arrangements, quietly handled to avoid further scandal beyond what Margaret's exposure will already bring, Charlotte continued, I believe an annulment can be arranged, given the unusual circumstances of my absence, and the marriage that followed in good faith during it. I will not stand in the way of whatever happiness you two have found together, nor pretend a reunion neither of us fully wants simply because propriety might expect it. The library fell silent after she finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over all three of them. Alaric looked to Elara, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression that she had rarely seen from him even in their most honest moments together. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, he said to Charlotte, his voice thick with complicated gratitude. For your honesty tonight, and for 2 years of enduring what you endured, with more strength than I can properly imagine. You owe me only your happiness, freely chosen, Charlotte said, rising to leave them to the private conversation her revelation had made possible. Both of you have earned that much, I think, after everything this house has put you through. When the door closed behind her, Alaric crossed the room to where Elara stood, taking her hands gently in his own. 30 nights, he said softly. 30 nights, since you arrived here as a stranger I believed I could keep safely at arm's length forever. I find I no longer wish for any distance between us at all, Elara, if you will have me, freely and honestly, once the necessary legal matters are resolved. Elara felt tears rise, unexpected and overwhelming, relief and hope, and something that felt very much like the beginning of genuine happiness all tangled together. I came to this house counting nights out of fear, Alaric, uncertain whether I would survive whatever secrets it held. I find, now, that I would count 1,000 more such nights gladly, if it meant reaching this particular moment at the end of them. He drew her closer, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashmore Hall, the coldness that had once defined their marriage gave way entirely to something warm and certain and freely chosen. A beginning built at last on honesty rather than duty, on partnership rather than isolation, on a love that had grown, unexpected and undeniable, from the very darkness that had once threatened to keep them forever apart. 6 months had passed since the night Ashmore Hall's darkest secret finally broke into the light, and Elara stood now at the same terrace where she had once walked alone, grieving a marriage that seemed built on nothing but coldness and duty, watching a very different scene unfold before her. The garden had been restored, where wild hedges once choked the pathways, careful hands had cleared and replanted, and the dry, cracked fountain at its center now ran again, water catching the afternoon light in bright, dancing patterns. Alaric had insisted on the restoration himself, working alongside the gardeners some afternoons with his own hands, as though physically clearing away the neglect might help clear away, too, the lingering shadows of everything the estate had endured. You are thinking too hard again, Alaric said, coming to stand beside her at the terrace railing, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had become so natural between them these past months, so different from the careful distance of their first days together. I can always tell, by the particular furrow of your brow. I was only remembering, Elara said, leaning into him slightly, as his arm found its way around her waist. How different this same view looked to me once. How frightened I was, that first night, standing here and wondering what kind of man I had married. I gave you every reason for that fear, Alaric said, a familiar note of quiet regret still coloring his voice whenever the subject of those early days arose. I have spent these past months trying to earn back what I so carelessly damaged at the start. You earned it long before now, Alara said, turning to face him fully, somewhere between a locked door and a stack of forgotten letters, I think. Though I could not have told you the precise moment, even then. They had married properly in the spring, once Charlotte's annulment had been quietly finalized and the necessary time had passed to allow the household, and the wider world beyond it, to adjust to the complicated truth of Ashmore Hall's recent history. It had been a small ceremony, nothing like the hasty, loveless arrangement that had first brought Alara to this house, attended only by those who had earned a place in the story's difficult unraveling. Nathaniel, now formally elevated to full authority over the estate's management, standing as witness alongside a beaming Nora, who had wept openly through most of the brief service. The ceremony itself had been simple but heartfelt, held in the small chapel on the estate grounds rather than the grand cathedral such a marriage might once have demanded. Alara had worn a pale blue gown rather than elaborate finery, and Alaric had watched her walk the short aisle toward him with an expression so openly tender that even the practical, unsentimental Nathaniel had confessed afterward to feeling a suspicious tightness in his throat throughout the vows. For a man who once greeted his bride with such coldness on the front steps of this very house, Nathaniel had teased gently at the small gathering afterward, "You have become remarkably sentimental, Your Grace." "I have good reason to be," Alaric had replied, his eyes never leaving Alara across the room. "I very nearly lost the chance to know what genuine happiness in this marriage might feel like, through my own foolish caution. I do not intend to take a single day of it for granted now that I have found it." Clara had come as well, traveling from town for the occasion, and had spent a full evening afterward extracting every detail of the story from Alara that her careful, cautious letters had never fully revealed. "I knew something was wrong the moment your letters grew so careful," Clara had said, shaking her head over her tea. "I very nearly came to Ashmore Hall myself, whatever propriety said about it, when I did not hear from you for nearly a fortnight during the worst of it. I am glad you did not," Alara had told her honestly. "Whatever danger I faced, I would not have wished it anywhere near you as well." Charlotte had written twice since her departure, brief but warm letters, describing a small cottage near her family's home, a quiet life spent in her sister's company, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding connections that 2 years of enforced absence had strained but not entirely broken. Her most recent letter had mentioned, with evident happiness, a gentleman farmer in the neighboring village who had begun calling on her with increasing regularity, and Alara had felt genuine warmth reading it, gladness that Charlotte's own difficult story continued now toward a happiness entirely of her own choosing. Margaret remained at the modest property arranged as part of her sentence, and Alaric visited occasionally, though rarely, the visits carrying a complicated mixture of lingering anger and something that might, eventually, soften into a more settled understanding. Alara had accompanied him only once, curious to see for herself how the woman who had once dismissed her so coldly now occupied her diminished circumstances. "She has grown quiet," Alaric had observed afterward, on the carriage ride home, quiet in a way that suggests genuine reflection, rather than simple resentment at her circumstances. "I do not know if that constitutes forgiveness precisely, but it is something, I think, closer to peace than I expected to find in her." Nathaniel had proven himself, in the months since, an invaluable presence across the estate's daily management, his quiet competence earning him respect from tenants and household staff alike. He had begun, too, a cautious courtship of his own, with a young woman from the nearby village whose father managed the local mill, and Alara found herself delighted by the occasional shy smile that crossed his usually composed features whenever her name arose in conversation. The East Wing itself had undergone its own transformation. The western corridor's sealed room, once the site of such violence and fear, had been entirely refurbished, its heavy iron lock replaced with something lighter and less foreboding, its shattered mirror and torn ledgers long since cleared away in favor of new furnishings that carried no trace of the darkness once contained within its walls. Alaric had suggested, gently, that Alara might choose its new purpose herself, and she had decided, after careful thought, to transform it into a bright, airy studio where she had taken up painting in her quieter hours, filling the once forbidden space with color and light, rather than allowing its history to define it forever. "I did not want it to remain a wound in the house's memory," she had explained to Alaric when he first saw the finished room. Canvases and paints arranged where broken glass had once scattered across the floor. I wanted it to become something new instead. Proof that even the darkest corners of a place can be reclaimed, given enough patience and enough light. He had kissed her then, unhurried and certain, and told her that he could not have imagined, on that first cold night of her arrival, that the stranger he had banished so thoughtlessly to this very wing would become the person who taught him how to properly live in his own house again, rather than simply survive within its walls. The household itself had settled into a rhythm entirely different from the guarded silence that had once defined it. Where servants had once moved through the corridors with careful, watchful caution, wary of Margaret's sharp observation and quick judgment, the halls of Ashmore now carried an easier warmth, conversation, and occasional laughter drifting from the kitchens in a way Alara understood, from careful inquiry among the older staff, had not been heard so freely in many years, long before even the first Duchess's disappearance had cast its shadow over the house. Alara had taken it upon herself, in the month since the wedding, to know every member of the household properly, learning names and small details of their lives that Margaret had never troubled to gather in her decades of management. She found, in doing so, that the estate ran no less efficiently for the added warmth, and perhaps ran better for it. Staff who felt genuinely valued proving far more willing to bring small concerns forward before they grew into larger troubles, rather than concealing them out of fear the way the old regime had encouraged. "You have a gift for this," Alaric observed one evening, watching her review the week's household accounts with the same careful attention she had once turned toward uncovering Margaret's deceptions. A gift for seeing people clearly, and for making them feel seen in turn. "I do not know that I ever properly thanked you for bringing that particular gift into this house when it had gone so long without it." "You have thanked me a great many times," Alara said, smiling, "in ways both spoken and otherwise. I do not think either of us owes the other any further accounting of gratitude, Alaric. We are past that now, I think, and settled into something simpler, something that does not require constant measuring." He had laughed at that, a full, unguarded sound that still, even after months of marriage, struck her as remarkable, given how rarely she had heard anything but cold formality from him during those first difficult weeks. Now, standing together on the restored terrace as evening settled gently over Ashmore Hall, Alara found herself thinking of that first count she had begun so many months ago, the careful tally of nights marked in a journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard, born from fear and uncertainty about what each new day might bring. She no longer kept that count. There was no need for it now, no growing tally measuring endurance against danger, no anxious wondering what secret the house might yet reveal. What remained instead was simply the steady, unremarkable passage of ordinary days, each one building quietly upon the last, filled with small joys that felt, after everything that had come before, more precious for their very simplicity. A shared breakfast in comfortable silence, an afternoon spent painting while Alaric reviewed estate business nearby, an evening walk through gardens that bloomed now with the same care once given to uncovering the truth that had nearly destroyed them both. "What are you thinking now?" Alaric asked, watching her expression soften in the fading light. "That I am glad in the end, for every one of those 30 nights, Alara said, "even the frightening ones. Even the nights I did not know if I would survive what this house was hiding. They led me here, to this exact moment, and I would not trade the journey for an easier path that might never have brought us to this particular happiness." Alaric drew her closer, and together they watched the last light fade over grounds that had once felt so haunted by secrets and neglect, now settled instead into a quiet, hopeful peace, a house finally at rest, holding within its walls not fear any longer, but the steady, growing warmth of a marriage built, in the end, on honesty freely given, and trust hard won, strong enough now to weather whatever ordinary seasons still lay ahead of them both.